My name is Bill Thomas. I'm a writer, consulting producer, and now podcaster. I am now trying to use my experience as the brother of a murder victim to help other victims of violent crime. I'm working on a book on the unsolved Colonial Parkway Murders, and I'm the co-administrator of the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook group together with Kristin Dilley.
My name is Kristin Dilley. I'm a writer, a researcher, a teacher, and a victims advocate, as well as the social media manager and co-administrator for the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook page with my partner in crime, Bill Thomas. Welcome to Mind Over Murder. I'm Kristin Dilley.
And I'm Bill Thomas.
We're happy to be joining you again with another episode about the Colonial Parkway Murders, or more specifically today, about the Colonial Parkway itself.
You refer to the roadway, where
I do refer to the roadway.
Only 2 of the 4 Colonial Parkway murders actually took place.
That's right. If we still continue to refer to these as the Colonial Parkway Murders, which I feel like we just need to put a big asterisk behind it.
I've said recently in conversation with you, Kristin, that sometimes I think that the moniker Colonial Parkway Murders may be the biggest rabbit hole of all. As the years go by and we learn more information and more detail, I question more and more whether the Colonial Parkway Murders are even all related, let alone a series of 4 double homicides.
It is true. And that is definitely something that we've had conversation about both off air and on. But we wanted to talk today for our listeners, especially the listeners who are not local and do not have any knowledge of the Colonial Parkway. We wanted to talk a little bit about the roadway itself, the geography of the parkway, and the fact that the 4 double homicides labeled the Colonial Parkway Murders are not the only crimes that have been committed on the Colonial Parkway.
This is true. You sound very ominous.
I was reading really theatrically with my kids today, and that's just kind of carried over. Yeah, sorry about that, everybody.
No, I like it. I like it. What were you reading with the young people today?
Oh, we were doing some Edgar Allan Poe.
Oh, no wonder you're so ominous sounding. All right, so she's in an Edgar Allan Poe-ish mood.
Yeah, I'm going to try not to let the teacher voice spill over into the podcast voice. We're going to keep those 2 things separate.
But this allows you to convey some of the dark side of literature.
Yes, that's why I like doing Edgar Allan Poe. He's all about the dark, twisty side.
And some of the scariest books I read as a kid and some of the scariest movies I saw as a young teenager were all based on Edgar Allan Poe.
And interestingly enough, in the next 2 weeks, I'm going to be giving a lecture to the National English Honor Society about the fact that Edgar Allan Poe single-handedly invented the modern-day detective story. So if you love true crime, criminal minds, profiling, all that good stuff, that is Edgar Allan Poe's gift to the world. He actually invented the modern-day detective story and all of its tropes.
Wow, that's very interesting.
Yeah.
I feel like I learned something.
People think it was Sherlock Holmes. Sherlock Holmes was not the first literary detective. It was Auguste Dupin. So I'm looking forward to digging into that too, bringing true crime and English teaching together under one roof.
Not to mention scarifying horror.
Yeah, that too. So we do want to go ahead and jump in a little bit and get away from the conversation about my teaching.
Okay. You just referenced the teacher voice. That's all.
I totally did. But let's go ahead and jump into the background, as I know our listeners are eager to hear all that we have to say. We'll go ahead and actually just preface exactly what I said a couple of minutes ago. The Colonial Parkway murders are not the only deaths that have happened along the Colonial Parkway over the years. There are a lot of accidental drownings, for example, on the Colonial Parkway. There is an area around College Creek, which empties out into the James River, that has seen multiple accidental drownings by people who have gone swimming. Usually it's college kids or high school kids, and they've underestimated the really wickedly bad undertow and the currents and have ended up dying in the river. There really isn't more than a couple of years that goes by without 2 or even 3 accidental drownings in College Creek. One of them actually was a high school friend of my brother's who drowned while taking a swim, and he was just pulled under the current and drowned under there. So it is not unusual to hear death associated with the Colonial Parkway. But more relevant to our interests is another really brutal, awful murder that took place along the Colonial Parkway in May of 1977. However, this one actually took place on what I call the Jamestown end of the Colonial Parkway. The parkway runs between Yorktown and Jamestown. The Yorktown end is the one that we are more concerned about with the Colonial Parkway murders. The Jamestown end is the one that I think of when we get into the case of Audrey Jean Weiler and Michael Marnell Smith.
Before we get into that case specifically and its interesting tie-in to the Colonial Parkway murders, a little bit more on the history of the Colonial Parkway itself. The Colonial Parkway itself is actually a fairly new construct. As we've talked about on the podcast before, it's a 23-mile-long ribbon of land. It's a scenic roadway built by the National Park Service that stretches from the York River at Yorktown, as Kristin mentioned, over to the James River at Jamestown. Thankfully, everything is properly named, so it's easy to follow. The parkway itself connects the historic triangle, which is Jamestown, Yorktown, and Williamsburg in the middle. Several million visitors a year use the Colonial Parkway to drive through this beautiful kind of natural setting, and they're connecting to all of these cultural and historic sites. A lot of school children visit the area every year on class trips, and I know you see them in town pretty frequently.
You're not kidding. Yeah, if you were a local student here, especially growing up when I was growing up, which is the 80s and the 90s, you went on school trips. Yorktown, Jamestown, CW. It was a thing. That is one of the things that you did.
And CW stands for?
Colonial Williamsburg.
Even as far back as the 80s, when my older brother Richard and his wife Ann and their family were stationed there, my nephews played in the fife and drum corps at Colonial Williamsburg. So it's very big on history and, as you said, lots and lots of class trips and tourists and that kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. If you're a teenager here, usually you were in the fife and drum corps, or you worked at Busch Gardens. Like those were the summer things, or you worked in Colonial Williamsburg. That was very much the sort of things that you did if you were, say, middle and high school. There were very few people that I know who weren't involved in some way, shape, or form with Colonial Williamsburg, the fife and drum, or Busch Gardens.
Right. Making money as high school and college kids and taking care of the tourists while they're in town.
Yes.
The parkway itself is this 23-mile-long ribbon of land, as we've talked about, and it presented an interesting challenge for the National Park Service. The idea was to build a road that was going to connect all of these historic sites and then try to integrate an old-fashioned highway into this thread that was going to connect all of these sites. The idea is that there would be natural beauty and then it would run along both the York and James rivers. It would also fit into the National Park Service's prime directive, which is an interesting goal in and of itself. It's, quote, to conserve the scenery and the natural and historic objects and the wildlife therein, and to provide for the enjoyment of the same. A little bit old-fashioned in terms of the language, but you get the idea of what the goal would be. And they started the parkway in 1931, and it took quite some time, 26 years, to build the parkway. You have to remember, you're dealing with the Great Depression, then World War II, and they had a number of funding shortages as a result of those challenges. Colonial Parkway was finally finished in 1957. And the idea is to give yourself this opportunity to drive an old-fashioned, non-commercial highway that connects all of these sites. As Kristin knows, it also provides an alternate route for cars, but only cars. There's no commercial traffic allowed on the parkway if traffic backs up on Interstate 64.
Yes, that is the parkway is always my alternate. It's the way that when I go to work in the morning, because I work 35 miles away from my house, I take Interstate 64 in the morning, but in the afternoon, I always come back on the Colonial Park because it gives me time to relax after my day, but it also makes sure I'm not having to book it down the interstate at 75 miles an hour. The Parkway is a nice sedate 45. Beautiful no matter what you're doing, no matter what the weather is. It was very stormy and rainy today, but it was very beautiful all the same because you're getting the river. And one thing that's really interesting about the Parkway, I think you've mentioned this before, Bill, is that I think it actually takes the crown of America's thinnest national park.
It does, because in some cases it's only about 500 feet wide. It's just this ribbon of land, and we get into a little more detail in a second, how they acquired the land from a number of government and some private sources. So the design of the Colonial Parkway itself is based on parkways that were built in New York State. And they were, again, designed for automobiles only, designed to be very scenic. And they allow cars only, no trucks, no commercial traffic, no commercial sites whatsoever. So no restaurants, no gas stations, nothing. No stoplights, no overhead light, no billboards, no advertising whatsoever, and very limited access points. Now, this also means, though, that there's no gas stations or other places you could go to get help. So, for instance, if you're having car trouble, or as we've talked about on Mind Over Murder, if there are more serious problems along the parkway, you're out there on your own.
There really are only a couple of places where you can get on and off the parkway. And so if you did, of course, run into trouble, you might end up being ultimately miles and miles away from the first potential place to get off the parkway.
So nearby, alongside the parkway, are various government sites. These are some of the places where they acquired the land to build the parkway. The Naval Weapons Station, Cheatham Annex, where high explosives, including nuclear weapons, are loaded aboard U.S. Navy ships. You can see that on the York River.
Yep.
The CIA's Camp Perry is also located along the Colonial Parkway. And, of course, Camp Perry is an extremely high security training facility, and it even has its own private airstrip, and they can fly their own aircraft in and out of there without anyone knowing what's going on. Kristin, I know you hear explosions from time to time.
Yeah, I'm near enough to Camp Perry. And again, we don't know the whole extent of how big Camp Perry actually is, but especially in the days leading up to what happened in Ukraine, there were days when there would be a lot of explosives. And my boyfriend did read an article that said that some of the training that was being done for some of the people who were working inside Ukraine was that they had actually trained here. It's at a southern CIA facility, and I'm like, let's Camp Perry. The other day was really cool. When I was coming home, there was a massive helicopter that lifted off out of Camp Perry. Like, it came out through the trees, went over the interstate, banked, came right back around, and then went right back down into the trees again. I could see it as I was driving home. It's crazy. Yeah, they have their own airspace, and yeah, you can hear some pretty crazy things. I've been hearing helicopters a lot the last couple of days.
Very interesting. As we talked about, sometimes the parkway itself is only about 500 feet wide. And understand that typically you're running alongside the York or James River, and then you can't always see it because these government facilities adjoin the parkway. Oftentimes through the woods, not a great distance away, is a chain link fence. And the government facilities are on the far side. Now, I don't think most people that drive the Colonial Parkway would think about it very much, but Kristin and I, knowing that the road also has a dark past, have recognized that one thing that's a little bit spooky about the Colonial Parkway is you've got the river on one side and a often hidden chain link fence in the woods on the other side, a very limited access. You can go miles before you're reaching the next exit. So you're very much locked into this kind of long chute. When I first went to the Colonial Parkway after my sister Cathy's murder, it occurred to me that there were aspects to the layout of the road that actually lent itself to potential crimes like these because it is so restricted in terms of access. And if someone was after you, it would be very difficult to get away.
And as you were mentioning before, because of the lack of overhead lights and buildings adjacent to it, it is very dark.
That was my biggest takeaway. A couple of years ago when we were shooting the television series, The Lover's Lane Murders, we were out there at two different points for weeks, about a year apart, shooting the various segments of the show. And I remember being out there with a television crew, and there were probably 8 or 10 of us. And I just could not get over how pitch black it is out there at night. There are no lights whatsoever. It's just the road and the woods and the river, and these government facilities, as we talked about, are also heavily wooded. There's nothing really near the perimeter of those government sites, so that all is just darkness. And I remember a number of us working one night late and having a discussion about predators in the woods. And we were talking about animals, but
we're talking about bears.
Yeah, but we're also not just talking about bears. And even though there were 10 or so of us, including a couple of former FBI agents who I'm sure were probably armed.
Oh, yeah.
As they often are.
Yep.
It still was spooky.
Yeah, it is.
It can be very freaky. To that end, in the 1980s, when we're talking about the Colonial Parkway Murders era, the Colonial Parkway itself can present some security issues, especially at night. Parkway is patrolled by National Park Service rangers driving standard issue cop cars. And in the 1980s, the Colonial Parkway was described as being extremely lightly patrolled. And some area law enforcement officers have described the parkway as, quote, the Wild West, unquote. And one veteran police officer said to me, if people knew how lightly patrolled the Colonial Parkway was, no one would have gone there at night. You were pretty much out there on your own.
I still will not go out there at night, not because I'm scared for my safety. It's just very dark and it is rather spooky. And I don't like the idea of what would happen if I got into car trouble on that road.
And as we've talked about, there's kind of two aspects to the Colonial Parkway. There's the daytime feel of the parkway with tourists going by and people enjoying all sorts of leisure activities along the rivers, biking and hiking and just enjoying themselves. But at night, it's pitch black. It's still fairly lightly patrolled, although things are better now than they were back in the 1980s. With zero lighting and very little traffic at night, the parkway has become known as a place for couples to go to be romantic, teenagers partying. I know that Joyce Call Canada and other people have told us the parkway was the place to go because they knew there weren't very many cops there. The rangers were thinly spread and they could go out there and party and pretty much have the place to themselves. It was also known as a place where gay cruising took place, especially at the now closed Ringfield Plantation picnic area, which was very secluded from the parkway, although you drove onto the looping road of the Ringfield Plantation via the parkway. And the little half-moon pull-offs that we've talked about along the Colonial Parkway were known as places where people would buzz in, meet another car, make a low-level drug deal, buying some pot or something like that, make the purchase, and make their exit very quickly. So it had a darker side, and I mean that in both senses of the word, at night and especially on the sort of third shift, the late night along the Colonial Parkway.
As the resident local of the two of us, I thought it would be interesting to take everybody on just a little geographical tour down the Colonial Parkway. It has occurred to me a number of times now that it would not go amiss for me to get a GoPro and put it on the hood of my car and actually take a tour that I could video and post on our site for everybody. It is something that I think I would like to do at some point so that everybody can really get an eye view of what it is like to drive the parkway start to finish.
I think it's a great idea. We'll put it on our list of things to do.
As I mentioned, there are basically two ways that you can get on the parkway if you want to start at either end. And you can start at the Jamestown end or you can start at the Yorktown end. And then in the middle, you get to Colonial Williamsburg. Let me walk you guys through. This is what the Colonial Parkway is like if you get on it at the Yorktown end. And this is how I go home from school every day in the afternoons, because I refuse to deal with the interstate in the afternoons. I want a nice little bit of time to roll the window down, blast my music, and I can do that on the Parkway. You get onto the Colonial Parkway after going through the Yorktown Battlefields area. You head toward Williamsburg. The first place that you would encounter that is of significance to the Colonial Parkway murders is Heath Call's car's dump spot at the York River pullout. You would come upon next the Cheatham Annex pullout, where Cathy Thomas's car was found. That's about 1.5 miles further down the road toward Williamsburg. If you were to continue driving, less than 1 mile from Cathy's car's dump site is the closed Ringfield Plantation picnic area. That's on the right. And then that actually brings to an end the section that runs along the York River. After you cross Kings Creek, you come to the area that has no pullouts that runs alongside the Naval Weapons Station. Eventually, you get to a turn for the weapons station's main gate. If you take a right, you end up right at the weapons station. If you take a left, you head toward Interstate 64 and Route 199. There's then a section of the parkway that passes through the Queens Lake area, and then a section that runs through to Colonial Williamsburg. And then finally, once you get past CW, you end up in the final stretch of the parkway that travels along College Creek and the James River, and it ends at Jamestown Island. And that is the section of the parkway that we're concerned about during this episode.
You're listening to Mind Over Murder. We'll be right back after this word from our sponsors. We're back here at Mind Over Murder.
And that is the section of the parkway where Audrey Jean Weiler was a mother of 2. She was out sunbathing on the beach on the Colonial Parkway near to the Jamestown Island end on her 36th birthday. And so that was Monday, May 23rd, 1970. She was at an area that I actually know really well. It's called the Archer's Hope Pullout. So each of the pullouts in the Colonial Parkway has a historical marker or a sign denoting here's some interesting thing that's either nearby or right here at this pullout. This pullout is called Archer's Hope. So I'm really familiar with the Archer's Hope pullout because it's a place where I used to go during high school. If I needed to decompress after a long day of being a stressed out high school student, I would jump in my little Geo Metro convertible. I don't know if I've ever told you what kind of car I drove when I was a high schooler, Bill, but there it is, Geo Metro convertible.
I'm picturing it in my head. What color was this Geo Metro?
A little white Geo Metro convertible. I called it the roller skate.
Yeah, very cute cars.
Yes. So I would head out there and take some books and my journal and just sit out there on the beach. It's a very beautiful pullout. You've got the James River and a wide swath of beach that kind of does a little C-shaped curl. You can see the Surrey nuclear power plant across the river, but don't let that spoil your view. It's really a very beautiful place. And so Audrey Weiler was out sunbathing in this area known as Archer's Hope. So a little background on Audrey Weiler. And unfortunately, we don't have a ton on her because this case, for whatever reason, did not get a lot of media coverage. We ended up having to do quite a bit of scouring, and we found a lot on courtesy of newspapers.com and the New York Times archives. But there wasn't a ton of information out there. I couldn't even find a picture of Audrey Weiler. But we do know that she was a graduate of James Blair High School, which is no longer a high school. James Blair is actually now a middle school. Graduate of the class of 1959. And at the time of her death, she was a student at the College of William and Mary. So on the morning of her 36th birthday, she left a note for her 2 daughters, whose names were Heather and Holly. She let them know while they were at school that she was going to go for a walk. She would be home soon, and she instructed them in the note to stay in the house and in the yard after school until she returned. She parked her dark green Vega, and I don't know what that is. Is that a Chevy, maybe, Mr. Thomas, car guy?
Chevrolet Vega.
So I wondered if it was related to Daniel's Chevy Nova. Vega, I don't know.
Chevy
theme.
Yeah, Chevy Vega was a cheaply built, half-assed attempt at an economy car. The Chevy Vega and the Ford Pinto were among the first attempts by the major Detroit auto companies to build a small car. They weren't very good cars.
Okay. Saw Vega and I was like, I wonder if this is in any way related to the Nova because they sound similar.
Yeah.
And so there we go. She had a dark green Chevy Vega and she drove that out to the Archer's Hope pullout. And that is adjacent to a very interesting little compound, I think we'll call it for now, which is the Gospel Spreading Church Farm, which Bill is going to give us more about. So Audrey probably did not plan on staying out too terribly long. Investigators said that there is a beach blanket that she would normally have used for sunbathing that was still at her house. It wasn't with her things. So maybe she didn't plan on staying too terribly long. At some point or another, though, Audrey Weiler encountered Michael Marnell Smith. He was a Vietnam War vet and a father of 3 who lived on the Gospel Spreading Church Farm, which is adjacent to the Archer's Hope turnout. She ended up with briars in her feet from walking along barefoot on the beach. That can happen. Apparently, when he encountered her, he asked, would you like some help getting those briars out of your feet? And she said, sure. At which point he pulled her into the adjacent underbrush, pulled out a hunting knife, forced her to disrobe. He then raped her, choked her, dragged her down to the beach, held her head underwater, and stabbed her in the back. And according to investigators, there were multiple puncture wounds to her chest and back. Just awful. Her body was found floating in the river around 4:15 p.m. And what's interesting about this is that park rangers from the National Park Service actually found Audrey Weiler's purse in a grassy area off of the ramp leading from the parkway to the Kings Point subdivision, which is near Route 199. Her purse was found in the grass. Park ranger pulled over, picked it up. He noticed, hey, a lady has lost her purse. Her ID was still in it. And he decided, I think I'd better go look and see if this lady is anywhere nearby. And following his hunch that maybe something untoward had happened, he found Audrey Weiler's body in the river. Her sandals, her book, her car keys had all been left on the beach, and her 2-piece swimsuit and her green corduroy pants were found in the woods nearby. And the hunting knife and its sheath that Michael Marnell Smith used to murder her were found in a marshy area near to the Gospel Spreading Farm. Now, Michael Marnell Smith eventually confessed to killing Audrey Jean Weiler. There were newspaper articles on Tuesday saying, hey, we have no leads. And then on Wednesday, Michael Marnell Smith confessed and was arrested. His claim is that the devil made him kill Audrey Weiler. I don't know how much we want to buy into that, but according to Michael Marnell Smith, the devil had made him kill Audrey Weiler. The main reason that I don't tend to buy into it is because Michael Marnell Smith was already a violent criminal who had been convicted previously of an attack pretty similar to this one. 5 months earlier, prior to Audrey Jean Weiler's death, Michael Marnell Smith had been released on unsupervised parole after a 3-year stint in jail for raping an 18-year-old woman. He had been given a 25-year sentence with 15 of that suspended, and he only served 3 years. And it wasn't until he wasn't even out 5 months before he found Audrey Weiler on the beach and murdered her.
I'm floored by this. This is part of an era when it felt like no one was taking sexual assault seriously. Mm-hmm. This man is sentenced to a 25-year sentence, 15 of which were suspended. So now we're down to 10 years. And then he ends up serving 3 years. This is for a brutal rape.
It was a rape that you can definitely see echoes of that first crime in the murder of Audrey Weiler. The victim in this first crime was not identified by name. They only called her the girl. But let's be real, she was an 18-year-old. She was a woman, but they only called her the girl. In 1973, this woman was riding a bike out along Turkey Island Road. It's a great name for a road. And Michael Marnell Smith actually stepped out of the woods, wrestled her off of her bicycle, forced her back into the woods at gunpoint using a .38 caliber pistol, and then raped her and threatened to kill her. She pled for her life, and ultimately he agreed to let her go as long as she promised not to tell anyone, and as long as she told him her address so that he could keep watch on her. as gross and icky as that sounds. Fortunately, of course, she did go to the authorities. She did report it, and Michael Marnell Smith was arrested for that. And that is the crime for which he was given 25 years, 15 suspended, only 3 served.
And then amazingly, Smith is out of jail for 5 months after raping this young woman, and it's on an unsupervised parole on top of everything else. Unbelievable.
Oh, that made me so angry. It made me so angry. I just can't even. So here is a guy who should not have been out of jail at all. Can't even keep his nose clean for longer than 5 months before embarking on this truly brutal, awful murder. This didn't get a lot of media coverage. Like I was saying a couple of minutes ago, there wasn't much that I could find on this. And certainly it didn't have the notoriety that the Colonial Parkway Murders did when I was growing up. I was not familiar with this crime in the least. It wasn't until I started doing my research with you, Bill, in 2016 that I heard about Audrey Jean Weiler and Michael Marnell Smith. And I was floored that anything had ever happened out there, especially because it turned out like I'd been hanging out in this spot very happily as a teenager with no idea that there had been a really brutal crime committed there.
Sadly, Michael Marnell Smith is preying on these young women from his home base. He lived at the Gospel Spreading Church farm. Now, many people have asked us over the years when they're driving along the Colonial Parkway or they're looking at photographs along the Colonial Parkway, there are these very distinctive large red barns near Jamestown with large white crosses on them, and it's clearly a dairy farm. And that is the location of this Gospel Spreading Church farm, which has a very proud history in addition to some conflict surrounding it. The Gospel Spreading Church farm is an outgrowth of the Gospel Spreading Church, as you might figure. And the church itself was founded by a man named Elder Lightfoot Solomon Michaud, who was a very well-known African-American preacher in the 1930s and actually achieved national prominence with a series of the Gospel Spreading churches in a number of locations along the East Coast, including Washington, D.C., and of course in Virginia. The farm itself was founded by Elder Michaud as an intended location for the purpose of creating a national memorial to the progress of the colored race in America. Michaud envisioned a mecca for African Americans seeking musical, educational, and spiritual programs. There was a number of attractions were built there, and there were additional things that were supposed to be built and ultimately were not completed. Michaud had chosen this location because of its proximity to Jamestown, where many people feel that some of the first African-American slaves were brought to the United States. He felt that as this important historical location, that this would be an excellent location to build this church and this national memorial. There were a number of outdoor activities that took place there in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. And as a matter of fact, a number of different touring concert artists played there, playing concerts at this particular location, up to and including the rock and roll era. They had planned a whole array of attractions, a monument to Booker T. Washington, a church, of course. They wanted to build a radio broadcasting station, college buildings, and, of course, the Gospel Spreading Church farm. Reverend Michaud actually had a great deal of success as a radio preacher. And Howard Smith, who's the brother of Michael Marnell Smith, is also a minister, and he began ministering to his brother after his brother Michael was taken to the Williamsburg, James City County Jail for Audrey Jean Weiler's murder. After Michael Marnell Smith was sent to the state prison in Richmond, his brother Howard Smith and other family members continued to come to the jail and offer Wednesday night services for the inmates. The church has a very proud tradition. It's not without its conflict. The Smith family, who have been caretakers for the land for decades, have had some disputes with the organizers of the Gospel Spreading Church in terms of their right to build additional structures on the property and so on. So there's been some back and forth between the elders of the church and the members of the Smith family, not necessarily related to the Michael Marnell Smith murders. What controversy has existed in the last 20 years or so has mostly been over land use and the rights inherent for the Smith family as caretakers. It's a very large family, 12 brothers and sisters. A number of them work in city government. One of the brothers is a fire chief, others are teachers, and they also run a school bus company, which has contracts with a number of schools in James City County.
So very interesting, a very interesting bit of local history there that, again, that is not something that I was aware of until we started doing our research here. Ultimately, for the murder of Audrey Jean Weiler, Michael Marnell Smith was found guilty and he was sentenced to death. He was executed in the electric chair on August 1st, 1986, which is, of course, very close to the murder of Cathy Thomas and Rebecca Dowski. Michael Marnell Smith was the 12th person in the U.S. to be executed in 1986, and he was the 62nd to die in the United States since the Supreme Court allowed the death penalty to be reinstated in 1977. So at the time of his execution, Michael Marnell Smith was 40 years old. He spent 8 years on death row, and to that point, he was the longest serving prisoner in Virginia on death row. He was ultimately the 5th person to be executed in Virginia after the Commonwealth reinstituted the death penalty in 1982. Interestingly enough, too, his execution was the first one since 1977 to which reporters were allowed to be witness. So a quote from a New York Times article about the execution reads, "Reporters from a newspaper, a televised station, a radio station, and a news service sat with an accountant, a college biology professor, and 4 law enforcement officers behind a plexiglass shield to watch Mr. Smith die." There was some interesting legal back and forth. Michael Marnell Smith's lawyers did ask for a stay of execution from lower courts until the U.S. Supreme Court could rule on whether death sentences were applied unfairly against Black defendants when their victims were white, which was the case with Michael Marnell Smith, who was Black, and Audrey Jean Weiler, who was white. The Supreme Court did ultimately refuse to review that appeal, and so Michael Marnell Smith was executed. He was apparently calm and composed in his last couple of hours and prayed, apparently, all the way up until the minute when the electricity hit his body. Audrey Weiler's brother, Walter Robertson, had this to say about his sister's killer's execution, and I like this quote a lot. "The only thing I want to say is finally justice has been done. It's been carried out according to the letter of the law, and there's a lot of relief knowing that it is over." He went on to say that he did not feel any ill will toward Michael Marnell Smith's family. He says, "It is not meant to be hateful, but maybe now the Smith family can understand what we've been through the last 9 years. They have feelings like we do. I think we share a common feeling of having lost someone." And of course, interesting for this case in particular, Michael Marnell Smith was put to death only about 10 weeks prior to the death of Cathy Thomas and Rebecca Dowski. And I know you feel, Bill, that if he had been alive, Michael Marnell Smith would probably have been a suspect in their murder.
And over the last couple of years, I've spent a fair amount of time exploring what I recognized was perhaps a long shot. But I remember being so struck by the fact that in exploring the Colonial Parkway murders, Cathy and Becky's death specifically, I was so struck by the fact that only 10 weeks prior to Cathy and Becky being brutally murdered on the Colonial Parkway, not far from where Michael Marnell Smith had prowled, it occurred to me, with no disrespect to the Smith family, to at least ask the question, could it have been possible that someone from the Smith family had lashed out in this way? When we talk about the building of the Colonial Parkway in the 1931 to 1957 timeframe, most of the property that was acquired to build the Colonial Parkway was acquired from government sources, all those government facilities that we talked about a few minutes ago. But some of the land was acquired from private sources, including the gospel-spreading church farm. Mm-hmm. The National Park Service purchased land that ran along the river near the location where those events that we spoke about, those fairs and picnics and concerts that were held for largely African-American audiences in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, that was the land that was acquired by the National Park Service. And it had occurred to me that it might be possible for members of the Smith family or the congregation from that church to feel a great deal of resentment because this beautiful riverside that had originally been envisioned for Elder Michaud's museum and memorial was purchased by the National Park Service. And of course, that precluded him ever being able to build that incredible facility that he had envisioned. It just occurred to me that this congregation might feel some resentment. Now, I've never been able to find any connection between the Smith family and the Colonial Parkway murders. But your final point from a moment ago, Kristin, that if he had been alive, Michael Marnell Smith would have been a suspect in Cathy and Becky's murder. I think there's no question about it. He'd been put to death a matter of weeks prior. Could someone have lashed out afterwards? I suppose. The people that are regarded as leading suspects these days by the FBI do not include anyone from the Smith family or Gospel Spreading Church Farm. It's something that I couldn't help but think about as we explored different possible suspects and different avenues that could have had a connection to the Colonial Parkway murders and specifically Cathy and Becky's murder.
Yeah, that was definitely one of the many rabbit holes that I remember us tumbling down and spending a good deal of time talking about. I remember one of the first times you came down here to do some media with Andy Fox and others. You and I went for a drive on the Colonial Parkway, and you were so excited when I showed you, look, here's Gospel Spreading Farm.
Yeah.
Like, oh, pull over. I want to get some photos.
Well, I'd read so much about it. And again, I'm not saying that anyone from that church had anything to do with the murders, but it was a very strange coincidence.
Yeah.
By the way, Michael Marnell Smith's body is buried at Gospel Spreading Church Farm, and there's a small memorial there. His 12 brothers and sisters obviously are saddened by what happened, and I don't think there's any question that Michael Marnell Smith was deeply mentally ill. The rest of the family has gone on to do lots of great work in the community and as business owners and government leaders. And Michael Marnell Smith does seem to be, the odd man out in his family who seem like pretty righteous people. But I couldn't help but find the time several years ago to explore the possibility that there could be a connection between Gospel Spreading Church Farm and unsolved murders on the Colonial Parkway, particularly since the elders of that church would have felt a significant sense of ownership and maybe a sense of being wronged in some way by the National Park Service acquiring that land.
When we talk about parkway adjacent cases, usually we're talking about cases that we think may have something to do with our original double homicides. But in this case, I feel like you could also call this parkway adjacent, largely because here is the murder of a young woman by a predator on the parkway within a fairly similar time span. So definitely Audrey Jean Weiler would not be considered a victim of the Colonial Parkway murders as we know them, but she is definitely a victim of a murder on the Colonial Parkway. And I hate the fact that it seems like the case has largely been forgotten outside of her family. I hope that we're able to give at least a little bit of her voice back here in telling her story. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Mind Over Murder. We'll see you next time.
Mind Over Murder is a production of Absolute Zero and Another Dog Productions.
Our executive producers are Bill Thomas and Kristin Dilley.
Our logo art is by Pamela Arnois.
Our theme music is by Kevin MacLeod.
Mind Over Murder is distributed in partnership with Crawl Space Media.
You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram.
You can also follow our page on the Colonial Parkway Murders on Facebook.
And finally, you can follow Bill Thomas on Twitter at BillThomas56.
Thank you for listening to Mind Over Murder.